Class 50s, Hoovers, Vacs, English Electric, large Type 4s. Call them what you will, but the most frequently asked question by those who don't care for this much-loved type is why? Why take a super reliable design like the DP2 prototype and burden it with a load of heavy, expensive and untried kit? Why build a new class as a 7-year stopgap at all? And why, after a somewhat checkered career, allow some of them back on the main line only 3.5 years after withdrawal? Retrovision 50s may not answer any of these questions, but there's a huge amount of nostalgia to be had from the pictures. This isn't retro footage, however. It's 5003-1 and 49 departing from Newport with an Arriva trains working. Year zero for the D400s, as some people insisted on calling them, was 1967, when British Railways decided not to order even more brush Type 4s because of persistent problems with their saucer engines. The original build schedule was July 67 to June 68, but a lack of generators put back the start of production until August 67. Although wired internally for multiple working, only the first two emerged from the works with external control cables. The rest were retrofitted for the introduction of multiple working on Anglo-Scottish passenger traffic in May 1970. The new class finally enabled British Railways to eliminate steam traction from its last bastion in the northwest of England, not to mention giving the underpowered small Type 4s, or Class 40, a breather on the west coast north of Crewe. The last one, D449, left Vulcan Foundry in December 1968, 5 months behind the original schedule, but only a year since the first one emerged. Although leased to British Rail by English Electric, the entire class was allocated to the Stoke division of the London Midland region and based at Crewe Diesel Depot. This is the site most people remember from the early days of Class 50, double-headed passenger trains in Cumbria. That came later, however. For the first 2 or 3 years of their life, they worked almost everything single-headed, and I do mean everything. As a genuine mixed traffic loco, hence the slow speed control and wheel slip detection, they were able to handle all manner of freight traffic with ease. Newspapers, parcels and early freight liners, including containerised traffic to and from the new Roots Motors plant at Linwood near Glasgow. So if you ever owned a Hillman Imp, parts of it probably enjoyed a spot of Hoover haulage over the fells too. D431 pulls away from Carlisle with the Up Royal Scot in 1973. And to further disprove the point about double headers, another single loco pulls into Carlisle with a Euston bound working on the same day. D439 pulls away from Carlisle with 1A85 bound for London. The double-headed workings of 14 Anglo-Scottish trains each day called for 8 pairs of locos and accelerated timings between Crewe and Glasgow by some 50 minutes over the earlier diesel traction, but not via the set in Carlisle obviously, as here. Electric working was extended northwards from Crewe to Preston in July 1973. And the full electrification to Glasgow opened only 9 months later, placing something of a question mark over British Rail's fastest diesel fleet. It's claimed that BR always intended to transfer the type to the western region once their work on the Midland was done, which may be what the late 1960s traction plan was talking about when it referred to the early elimination of diesel hydraulics. Whatever, it's hard to see what else English Electric would have done with them, other than send them overseas, so British Rail ended up with an almost new fleet at a knockdown price, but also had to take over their maintenance from the builder. Not exactly an enticing prospect. The transfer from northwest to southwest actually began in October 1972, when the original D400 went to Bristol Bath Road for trials and crew training. 401 and 402 followed during 1973, but the big transfer happened over the weekend of the 4th and 5th of May 1974, when more than 20 locos changed regions. This then was the allocation picture at the end of that year. The 15 locos remaining at Crewe transferred over in dribs and drabs throughout 1975, until the full allocation was finally established on the Western in January 1976, more than 3 years after the first one went west. The Class 50s were initially deployed on express services between Paddington and Bristol, where their 100 miles an hour capability improved timings, and their electric train heat generators allow the introduction of Mark IIe air-conditioned stock, beyond the capability of steam heat Westerns, which began their slow decline at the same time. Early in 1974, shortly before receiving its TOPS number, 402 shuffles between platforms at Paddington. The loco is still carrying an English Electric owner's plate, but its sale to British Rail is also imminent. With the big transfer of locos in May 1974, enough 50s became available for their introduction on West of England services. 50013, the last to receive a TOPS number in June 74, and incidentally the last to carry original Rail Blue, passes Fairwood Junction, carrying the short-lived double arrow amidships that replaced the lease plaques on some locos for a short time before nameplates appeared. Coming up, 50003 near the same spot, heading west with a Motorail working in July 1976, a time when drivers and cars accompanied each other on the same trains. .50014, recently named Warspite, heads into New Street Tunnel with a Birmingham to Paddington intercity service in July 1978. It would be wrong to suggest that at any time the 50s reigned supreme on the Western. They had the West of England route pretty much to themselves during the long hot summer of 1976, apart from the handful of surviving Westerns, but they'd already lost the Bristol work earlier that year when the first 125 sets arrived. So, for the second time in their short lives, they were a short-term stopgap, as indeed they were on the Plymouth and Penzance front line workings, until later batches of HSTs took over at the end of the decade. Good quality cine and video of those early years remains rare, and the reason is simple. Very few enthusiasts cared about them until the nameplates appeared in 1978 and gave them a whole new personality. 50041 Bulwark heads west at Westbourne Park with a train of aircons in the late 70s. While 50005, hauling fish in Cornwall, passes a classmate hauling the entire membership of the Class 50 fan club at that time. And wherever Westerns once went, so did 50s. 024 rounds the curve into Worcester Shrub Hill with the 1845 Hereford to Paddington in July 1980. It would be equally foolish to claim that the 50s were without their problems. Throughout the early years on the Western, their complex equipment was plagued by failures. So, having picked up the fleet for virtually nothing, British Rail decided to spend some money on the problems, with the aim of increasing overall reliability. The refurbishment programme lasted from 1979 until 1983 and was carried out entirely at Doncaster, which had taken over classified repairs of the locos from Crewe when they transferred to the Western. The refurb greatly simplified the design and made them, well, normal. No dynamic braking, which the Western region had isolated anyway, no slow speed control, and no inertial air filters that gave the distinctive vacuum cleaner sound. The result, once a whole new set of problems had been ironed out, was an improvement in average reliability from 10,000 miles to 16,000 miles per failure, but a hoover that no longer hooved. The first 6 refurbished locos were turned out in all over rail blue, but were instantly distinguishable from the rest by the high intensity headlight at each end. Here's 2 at Paddington in May 1980. 50001 arriving with a rake of empty stock from Old Oak Common, which 50019 will shortly back onto. From loco number 7 onwards, the revised large logo scheme was applied, which made identification of the refurbs ludicrously easy to all but the most myopic. These scenes at Laira show a mixture of the 3 types during the changeover period: refurbished in rail blue and large logo, unrefurbished in rail blue. In reality, the work was the class's first general heavy repair and a modification, but to save having to submit a set of design drawings for every loco, it was called a type refurbishment, which meant that one specification, once approved, could be applied to the entire class, thus saving both time and money, not a procedure for which the railway had any prior experience. The Laira itself had the capability to do both engine and bogie swaps on the class. After the rebuilding programme was complete, Doncaster continued to handle scheduled repairs until the end of 1986. 50042 Triumph was one of the last to be overhauled at Doncaster in January of that year, before Laira began a restricted programme of F exams on the class. At the London end of Exeter St David's, 50012 heads towards Paddington with a rake of aircon stock from Plymouth in August 1982. Benbow was the 16th loco to be refurbished, completed in May 1981. .30 arrives at Newton Abbot with an up service in 1984. Repulse was one of the last 3 to be refurbished and one of the last to receive an F exam at Laira in 1987. It was withdrawn with a main generator fault in 1992, again one of the last, and has had an uncertain career in preservation ever since. Currently though, it's the subject of a long-term restoration project at Peak Rail. 50021 awaits its next run at Exeter Stabling Point. .008 runs over the road crossing with an arrival from Paddington in August 1982. 50021 has done much the same thing before setting off westwards again. Yes, it could be going to Waterloo from that platform, but the coaching stock tells you it's not. 50024 begins another run beside the sea at Starcross. .5016 departs from Dawlish with a rake of HST Mark III's bound for Laira. The classic view across the platforms at Plymouth in 1982, with Achilles setting off for London. And coming up, the classic view of Dainton Bank, as another one in lovely large logo wends its way to the top. The crowds, though, are waiting for a double-headed steam special. For many Class 50 aficionados, the post-refurb large logo years are the nostalgic period, with each loco developing its own dedicated following. The howls of protest were no surprise then, when the blue of Hercules was taken out of the game early in 1984 and replaced with the GWR Museum livery of Sir Edward Elgar. Now, I understand the desire to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Elgar's death. Well, who wouldn't? But surely it could have been done just as well on a duff, or the livery quietly removed after the GWR 150 celebrations descended into acrimony a year later. No, 007 carried green to the very end, as it does to this very day. 50031 departs from Oxford in May 1986, while working one of the few remaining services from Paddington to Birmingham. At around the same time, 50042 motors past Aldermaston, with a Paddington bound working from London. .5034 sets off from Reading with the final leg of a Plymouth to Paddington service in 1986. A year on, the loco will begin its comparatively short career with Network South East, of which much more later. .5030 arrives at Reading with the Cathedrals Express, the 0700 from Hereford to Paddington. Conqueror enters the video age in December 1985 as it arrives from refuelling at Old Oak to collect its next train at Paddington. 5045 manoeuvres in the opposite direction after arriving from the west. Both these shots were taken from the old parcels dock, a convenience extension for photographers and filmers of Paddington's Platform 1. 50033 Glorious, now part of the National Collection based at Swindon Railway Museum, removes a rake of empty Mark 1s to the old oak carriage sidings. The business end of Platform 1 and the departure of 50009 were the typical formation, for the time, of a GUV and Mark II aircons. And 1986 was the last year we could enjoy a complete fleet, so here's how they stacked up allocation-wise. Almost twice as many based at Laira as in London, but only 5 months away from the sectorisation changes that would shake them up some more. Sectorisation was a necessary preamble to privatisation, or so the railway authorities would have you believe. I've always thought of it as a job creation scheme for the accountants and the unemployable. The end result was lots of playing about with silly pool codes and a blossoming of exotic liveries that could best be described as pandering to the worst excesses of bourgeois taste. But enough of my prejudice about the middle classes. The split of Class 50 at the start of sectorisation in May 1987 was as follows. Network South East, 25. Provincial, basically anything passenger that wasn't NSE, 7. Parcels, 8. And Departmental, 9. The sharp-witted amongst you will immediately have noticed that adds up to 49, and so it does. 50011 Centurion became the first 50 to be withdrawn in February 1987. It ended up as an engine testbed at Crew Works, its nameplates passing to 50040 as there was still a Centurion on the Royal Navy active service list, but not a Leviathan. I digress. The NSE allocation of 25 locos included 13 allocated to the Waterloo Exeter route, but not this one. .5035 Ark Royal pulls away from Plymouth in the first version of the clown livery. You'll also know this was the first of the class to be named, and the first to pass into preservation. It was handed over to the 50 Fund by NSE Supremo Chris Green in a ceremony at Old Oak in August 1991. A cheque changed hands too. To everyone's great confusion, Network South East livery immediately turned up on the sea wall, but to be surprised by that would imply a misunderstanding of what South East meant at the time. 50027 is one of the dedicated Waterloo Exeter batch and is working the all stations 0712 Newton Abbot to Exeter before starting its day's work properly on the London South Western, which was officially part of South East. Like Lion, this one, calling it Starcross, is also carrying the revised version of NSE livery with the straight stripes, and is also working the 712 all stations move for positioning purposes. Centurion Mark II, formerly Leviathan, departs from Exeter in 1987 and heads for the seawall with more NSE stock. .5043 arrives at Teignmouth with the 712 from Newton Abbot and picks up the cameraman for a ride through the Dawlish tunnels, which in this direction occur in the following order: Parsons, Clarks, Fillet, Corriton and Kennaway, before the line emerges on Dawlish seafront. I'll leave you to work out which of the 5 tunnels is mysteriously missing here. A rare double header at Collingwood and Lyme. Like the train, it's probably a positioning move. 16 years earlier, 27 became the first 50 to reach Penzance, the 19th of March 1974, if you're keeping notes. At the end of the day, 27 works the 5V17 ECS back to Laira, after it had arrived at Exeter as the 1515 from Waterloo, which the following morning became the 0712 from Newton Abbot, one half of a complex 2-part diagram we'll be seeing more of later. Leg 2 of this one was the 811 from Exeter to Waterloo. And again with 50005 at the business end. .50048 Dauntless was another of the initial NSE batch dedicated to the Southwestern. It was the third of the class to be named, in a ceremony at Reading in March 1978, only hours after 50010 had its place fitted without ceremony at Laira. And now, by way of a change, some Oxfords. 500306 departs from Reading with a Paddington to Oxford semi-fast in May 1990. While 50031 has charged at the 9:30 from Oxford at Slough a week later. Following few months of 1990, the remaining 50s at Old Oak moved away, as their time on the Oxfords came to an end. Later that day, 026 rounds the curve at Pangbourne with the 1400 from Oxford. As 426, this loco was the first of the class to have a tops number applied on the 29th of July 1973. 50042 at Bristol, one of 9 locos allocated to the Departmental sector in 1987, reflecting the second division nature of their existence that the new arrangements inflicted on the 50s. Bath Road Depot was another vast empty space the last time I looked, awaiting the arrival of B&Q, or perhaps IKEA. In 1976, the depot had an allocation of 20 Class 50s, including this one, when they were working high-speed expresses down from London. How times change. Another of the departmental allocation, 50019, transferred to the Civil Engineers fleet in February 1989 and lost its first scheme NSE livery in favour of this hybrid. A sort of rail blue, but with a large logo-style grey roof and numbers of indeterminate size. This loco held the record for the highest number of engine hours since overhaul, 12,444 apparently, but was noted for its engine reliability. 19 drops off its load in Bristol East Yard on the 23rd of August 1990, only 5 days before withdrawal, with the main generator fault. Oh, the irony. Staying with the non-standard one-off, the conversion of 5149 into a Railfreight machine in 1987 was another expensive experiment that led to very little. The original idea was to be able to use single 50s instead of pairs of 33s on stone workings. 049 was fitted with refurbished CP7 bogies and restricted to 80 miles an hour in the expectation of greater tractive effort and adhesion. In the event, the removal of sanding equipment and traction control during the refurbishment process produced exactly the opposite effect, and the experiment was short-lived. The loco ended up working speedlink services conveying China clay, like this one at Nanping Wharf in September 1988. 5 months later, 149 reverted to 049 and became an NSE passenger loco again. Curiously, standard Class 50s could regularly be found on Meldon Quarry ballast workings in the late 1980s, without having any money spent on them at all. For the full story of the Railfreight 50, you need to read one of David Clough's excellent books. Here's 49 conveying people again rather than commodities on a Waterloo diagram in March '89. First departing from Exeter St David's in the morning and showing off its Mark III NSE livery, revised dark blue in case you were wondering, with blue window surrounds. And pausing at Exeter Central that evening with the return leg before drifting down the challenging 1 in 36 gradients connecting the town centre with the out-of-town St David's. We round off with a selection of rail tours from the sectorisation period, starting with train tours Hoover Dam Buster from May 1988. 009 and 036 depart from Carlisle with the outward leg of the trip from Birmingham to Glasgow. Stirring old memories, I shouldn't wonder. Neatly consecutive 50031 and 50032 come off the Heathfield branch and run into Newton Abbot with the Taw TAW and Tor TOR rail tour of September 1990. Finally, the Valiant Thunderer rail tour of the 23rd of November 1991, featuring the locos of the same names, looking resplendent in their alternative liveries. Sadly, it was all fur coat and no knickers, however, because both were so worn out mechanically that they were restricted solely to rail tours and appearances at open days. Because of a defective speedo, 37142 was provided to pilot the train to Plymouth. The trio departs from Newton Abbot. At Plymouth, the cosmetic duo went to the back of the train, allowing 50033 to run at the front to Newquay. .008 and 015 await departure from Newquay. After rejoining the main line at Par, the pair head back towards civilization. Well, Plymouth. Plymouth, 50033 ran to the front of the train again for a triple heading of the tour back to Bristol. And here they are, successfully at journey's end, slipping away into the night. And now, some names set to music. Individual details of locos as previously discussed. See if you can spot the 13 which are adjectives. So, Class 50s on the Waterloo Exeters. Good idea or not good idea? Well, not suited to the work, that's for sure. Locos capable of running long distances at 100 miles an hour shouldn't be pottering along all stations from Salisbury, even if they brought some improvement to the timings. And anyway, I never heard anyone complain that the Class 33s were too slow for this secondary route, so I can only conclude that transferring 50s across to work the 2-hourly service was just another attempt to find them some work. True, they could run for short distances at high speed at the London end, but the track for the first 40 odd miles was so beaten up from the frequent EMU service that they tended to bounce rather a lot. Then there was the phenomenon of southern driving technique, which can best be described as either off or full on. The first 50s appeared at Waterloo towards the end of 1979 on various test runs, but they didn't take over the 2-hourly Exeters until the May timetable of 1981. Most of the diagrams called for 2 return trips in a day, which they could handle without the need to refuel. The unrefurbished locos with their strange driving technique baffled Waterloo drivers, who caned them mercilessly, until eventually only the more standard refurbished examples were allowed to venture over the southwestern. Reliability was always an issue and may have had more than a passing significance to the dedicated pools that arose in Network South East days. This was one of the 13 locos dedicated to the 9 daily diagrams when NSE was called into existence in 1987. Norwalk was lucky to survive the major damage it suffered in a derailment at Paddington with the Night Riviera sleepers in 1983. Another of the initial pool, 50027 Lion, arrives from Waterloo before taking away the ECS to Riverside sidings. This loco is in the third version of NSE livery, with the blue window surrounds and raised position for the nameplates. It was one of two locos bought by Mike Fuller in 1992, and these days can usually be found working on the North York Moors. .5001 pulls into St David's with the ECS for a Waterloo-bound departure. In 1987 there was still one weekday diagram for Mark I stock, but everything else had switched over to a mixture of early Mark IIs. From memory, I think 2D was about the most exotic variant we enjoyed, never the aircon version. Achilles pulls away from Fennerton on the long single track section from Pinhoe on the outskirts of Exeter to Yeovil, a distance of some 50 miles. .5007 arrives at Yeovil Junction in February 1991 with only 6 coaches in tow. From May 1989 a new pool of 20 Class 50s was established, along with 8 9-car and 4 6-car Mark II sets, to work the entire service between London and Exeter, including the 2-hourly Salisbury trains which the Class 33s had held on to until then. Allegedly, the best 20 locos were picked for this reorganisation and put into the NWXA pool, as opposed to NWXC, the Waterloo Exeter Reserve. I wonder what the C stood for. And just to prove that wrong, here's a couple of shots of 5-car sets between Sherborne and Templecombe on the same day. While we're watching these scoot about, here's a summary of NSE livery on Class 50s. 50017 and 023 were the first to receive the Mark I version in June 1986, a scheme applied to 12 locos in all. Revised light blue, without the upswept stripes, was applied to 11. And revised dark blue eventually found its way onto 17 locos. And here's one of the later variants arriving at Templecombe Station, with at least 4 air-conditioned Mark IIs in the following formation, so that's another theory out the window. This is Gillingham in Wiltshire as opposed to Gillingham in Kent on another single track section between Templecombe and Wilton Junction. 50030 heads for London with the 945 from Exeter. On the same section, in the middle of nowhere, is Tisbury, a location that features the first appearance in this programme after 23 years of 50029 renown. A Waterloo Pool NSE loco from the very start in 1987 until the very end in 1992. And here it is again, at Salisbury, later in 1991. For obvious reasons, this was always a busy location, especially on Sunday evenings, when 3 loco hauled services left for London in the space of an hour. At around this time, mid-1991, cascaded Class 47-7s on NSE's Thames and Chiltern services were being replaced by 47-4s, with the aim of releasing the former Scottish pushers onto Waterloo Exeter services to replace the Class 50s. A great plan if the brush locos hadn't been even more worn out and prone to failure than the English electric ones they were meant to replace. In the end, poor 47-7 availability led to 3 Class 50s, 30, 33 and 50, being retained for Waterloo work at the start of 1992, extending their operation on the route until almost the end of May, as you'll see later. .5048 Dauntless passes Eastleigh in September 1990 with the 10 o'clock Waterloo Exeter, while on a Sunday diversion via Southampton owing to decorating work between Basingstoke and Andover. This is not a diversion though, but one of the exceptionally weird diagrams introduced as part of Network South East timetable redrafting, doing its stuff at Eastleigh. The 9:15 Waterloo to Eastleigh ECS approaches from the Basingstoke direction behind 50049 in June 1991. The loco and stock had already worked 2 legs of the diagram, the 5V29 ECS from Eastleigh to Yeovil Junction and the 0530 Yeovil to Waterloo with passengers. After recessing and a loco run round, the ensemble set off again from Eastleigh at 1400, empty once more, over the freight line via Chandler's Ford to Salisbury, from where they provided the 1513 passenger carrier to Waterloo. final two legs of the day's work were the 1815 Waterloo Exeter service and the 2210 Exeter to Newton Abbot, which the following morning became the 0712 from Newton Abbot you saw earlier in the show. And people worry about unnecessary carbon emissions today. Slightly more serious, on the face of it, the 0642 Yeovil to Waterloo, climbing up through Greatly behind 50028, though God knows where this one's diagram took it. Aberdeen, possibly. Hook between Basingstoke and Woking in August 1989, and the passing of 50003, which you last saw working cast to the west almost an hour ago. And you can also see what I mean about the bouncy track. Woking and its distinctive signal box saw the passing of the entire class between 1981 and 1991. On this occasion, in January 91, it's a very run-down and grubby Ajax, setting off again with the 1315 to Exeter. This immensely popular loco became the 44th of the class to be withdrawn when it donated its engine to keep 50007 going later that year. After keeping a low profile for nearly an hour of the programme, 029 makes a third appearance on the approach to Woking with the 1118 from Salisbury in April 1990. Having worked our way up the route, we finally reached Waterloo and the departure of 50036 with the 1515 to Exeter on the 27th of January 1991. Victorious was withdrawn 2 months later, not through any failure, but because it was due a major exam. Still, quite something to see a loco enlarged logo at Waterloo this late in the day, just like old times. 50050 meanwhile was returning to traffic in original Rail Blue guise, thanks to a repaint sponsored by Rail magazine, and it became a frequent performer on the Waterloo route in this scheme from April 91 onwards. This looks like another of those late night semi-ECS trips to Newton Abbot and Laira. And so to the final day of Class 50 operation between Waterloo and Exeter, the 24th of May 1992, featuring D400 and 50007. The first up service to London arrives at and departs from Honiton with a good crowd in tow. And this is the return journey, which I'll leave you to enjoy. A second departure later in the day for the final up working, Honiton again. And the very last working back to Exeter, complete with headboard, passes Wilton. Like the westerns that preceded them, various dead examples could be found lying around at Laira and at other places like Booth's Scrapyard. 50019 languished in the yard at Exeter for a time until the Class 50 Association rescued it. Today, Ramillies has found a good home on the Mid-Norfolk Railway. So here's a timeline summary of 20 years of Western Region Class 50s, starting with 5 years of undiluted and unrefurbished Rail Blue, which collided with the first of the loco namings in 1978. Rail Blue lasted until September 1984, when 50013 went into Doncaster for an intermediate repair, which means that at no time did the entire class appear in the same livery again, although 49 were in large logo from 1984 until NSE livery appeared in 1986. As we've seen, Rail Blue staged a comeback in 1991, paving the way for 2 whole years of farewell rail tours. The 3 retained locos, 50007, 033 and 050, worked 20 tours in various combinations between April 92 and March 94, but the Meldon Hoover was a solitary outing for 50033 on the 1st of February 92. It should have started from Waterloo, but didn't. Passengers caught it up at Clapham Junction for the onward trip to Exeter and Meldon Quarry. This is Bradford-on-Avon.
Carlisle 50 farewell featured 007 and D400 from Waterloo to Carlisle via Vulcan Foundry. Well, almost. The outward leg en route to Birmingham. And arriving at Crewe off the Shrewsbury line. Half the job done, the locos run round at Carlisle. .007 paired up with 033 for Pathfinder's Minster Marauder on the 7th of November 92. As the name suggests, the destination was York, with a kick-off from Eastleigh aboard the Southern D-Mew to catch up with the stock at Bristol after it was delayed by a failed freightliner. Typical rail tour. Passengers, stock and locos united, the tour sets off properly from Temple Meads. festive 50 tour at Llandudno Junction on the 5th of December 92. This tour did North Wales after setting off from Euston behind something electrical. After a run round at Llandudno, the tour heads up Blaenau Festiniog. And later in the day, in the dark, arrives at Holyhead. The Merseyman, a Bristol to the northwest complicated X which ran on the 30th of October 1993. You'll find the full route on upthejunction.com. The blasting away from and cameraman obliteration at Temple Meads. And penultimately, the Bishop's Triple on the 5th of June 1993, which featured all three of the retained locos and the You Cannot Be Serious Pilkington stock on a round trip from Minehead to Minehead via York. The whole thing finally drew to a close with the 50 Terminator Rail Tour on the 26th of March 1994, which took 007 and 050 back to old haunts for the last time in BR ownership, paving the way for a rapid return to the main line in private ownership. The last leg of the tour eases up to the Paddington buffer stops. So that's Class 50, about which I continue to have mixed feelings. Yes, they were a colossal waste of money, twice over, but they did generate equally colossal amounts of happiness during their comparatively short working lives. The problem is one of legacy. Because of the constant search for a permanent role, they didn't leave behind the same indelible impression as, say, the Westerns or the Deltics, which is a great shame when so many people love them so much.